Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of At the Movies with William Fletcher. As per usual, I am your host, William Fletcher, and I am joined this week by uh, Skylar, who would have been on the show earlier, but technical difficulties occurred. So uh, that, yeah. So an episode we did record did not go out. So this is technically Skylar's second time on the show, but first official time. And for this week's episode, we are going to be looking at the Godfather trilogy to tie into the release of Francis Ford Coppola's new film Megalopolis, which we'll talk about somewhat at the end of this. I mean, The Godfather. I mean, it's one of the most iconic films ever made.
Mhm.
I mean, how did you come to the Godfather films?
I don't remember the exact timeline, but I feel like The Godfather is a very like dad movie. Like everybody's dad loves The
Mm,
Godfather. Of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
everybody everybody loves The Godfather in general, but
Mm.
it's a very much a movie that like your dad shows you. um,
Yeah, yeah, it's like, oh, they don't make movies like this anymore, and it's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's a
it's
it's
like
a movie your yes, it's a movie your dad thinks is like one of the best ever, with reason. And I definitely watched the first one. I don't know how old I was exactly, 13, 14. Um,
mm,
and it is one that my dad like made a point of showing me like as soon as he realized I was starting to like develop an interest in movies. Um,
yeah,
so like the first time I watched it was definitely with my dad. Um, and then I think
mhm,
I rewatched it once or twice after that in the next few years. Um, but actually, when I rewatched it for this recording, I hadn't seen it in probably close to a decade. I don't know exactly. Um,
mhm.
so it was definitely very interesting and highly worth revisiting with like a more mature and refined perspective. Um,
Mm.
and I actually didn't. I never saw part two until probably a few years ago. So it's definitely
Mhm.
still it was definitely still removed in my memory and needed a rewatch. But I came to that
Mhm.
one much later than the first one. Um, so
Mhm.
I guess I had some level of nostalgia baked in for the part one that I just would have never had for part two. But
Mhm.
obviously, not to reference our long lost episode, but it's not like a Twister level of like childhood nostalgia where I just watched it obsessively as a young child.
Yeah.
Like it's in a different
Mhm.
class.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of this like, this is, yeah, top 5 all-time iconic films. Like, I don't think that's disputable. I think that's, like, I would put it up there with, I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and in terms of it's sort of like The Godfather's that kind of film that is it's one of the most referenced films in pop culture, just like in cartoons or in like other TV shows and films. There's always there's get references to The Godfather, and like there's enough references in other TV shows that I think you could recreate The Godfather with clips from other TV shows and films. Like it's that, it's like I think Psycho would also fall into that as well, or like that kind of film of there's just it's all been parodied or there's been an homage or like it's that ingrained into pop culture. So I come in to these films with a lot of baggage. To lay my cards on the table, I don't love any of these. I've got problems with them. There's elements of the films that I like, but as a whole, I am not massively invested in I mean, we'll get into this more as we go on, but I have no desire to watch them again. I think, and I don't know, and I don't know if I'd say that they're dated per se. They do feel like of a particular time, but I don't know if dated is the word I would use. They're not films that appeal to me. Like they are films that appeal, like as you were saying before, they are dad films. They appeal to, but I mean, I guess sort of while we're here, we should probably talk about Francis Ford Coppola as a filmmaker, because these are sort of his these are the films he will be remembered for, along with Apocalypse Now, I'd say as well. And I think he's such a fascinating filmmaker in the sense of he only really has like 4 films maybe that are like of any real renown, like The Godfather, Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now are sort of the 3 film everyone's like, "Oh, he's such a great filmmaker." But it's kinda like he's only really got 3 like, the Godfather first 2 Godfather films, Apocalypse Now. And I'll throw in the conversation, to be fair, in terms of films that are truly renowned as all-time masterpieces, and everything else he's made is just sort of not held up to that level. So I think it's interesting that he's seen as this one of the all-time greats when his filmography isn't as a whole. Like it'd be like sort of if you look at Steven Spielberg, but Spielberg had only made, Jaws, Close Encounters, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T., and everything else that had been made was like Warhorse level shit. Like it had all been that. Like That's sort of the general idea. I just think it's interesting that he's seen as one of these all time greats.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to be fair, I feel like most people are like understandably put him on a pedestal, just because I think you can't make films of such a stature and level of acclaim as like The Godfather Part One and Two, Apocalypse Now, and The Conversation without like just automatically reaching a certain pedestal. Like most filmmakers will realistically never make a string of films that beloved no matter what. But
Mm,
there's certainly a gap between like him and Spielberg, Scorsese, any of these like filmmakers that broke out around the same time, but clearly
mm,
like hung on longer and are still making like acclaimed movie after acclaimed movie and have like literally a dozen plus movies that everyone loves.
yeah.
Which I think, I don't know, I think most people acknowledge that deficit where Coppola, once the 70s ended, kind of just like not went off the deep end, but like went into very not crowd pleasing, artsy territory, and then some like random comedy, like all over the place tone wise. um,
Yeah.
he he certainly never failed to be interesting. Um,
Mm,
Perhaps he's definitely gone the most avant garde of like the classic quote unquote film bro new Hollywood
mhm,
directors. Like he completely abandoned his original style for like a bunch of crazy things he just felt like making. And there's something
mm,
to respect there. But
mhm,
I also haven't seen a lot of his like 80s, 90s movies, or
mhm,
2000 movies. So I can't like speak to them personally. But there's certainly a level of like, okay, I respect you for just like going completely in whatever direction you felt like, doing whatever you wanted. You didn't pigeonhole yourself is not as much as some others. not that Spielberg
Mhm.
and Scorsese make the same movie every time, or that they've never experimented, but they definitely stayed more within like a typical lane that most people would enjoy. Obviously, his films from the 70s are put on this insanely high pedestal. And I think
Mhm.
even if one doesn't like personally connect to all of them, it's like easy to see why they're of that stature
Mhm.
in film history. And like there's much to be said about the craft and how he like essentially created like the modern gangster movie, the modern war movie. Like
Yeah.
he like created these niches out of thin air, more or
Mhm.
less. Not that no one had ever made a movie about a gangster before or the mafia. Not that it had never been done, but he really like created the mold, um,
Mhm.
that even like Scorsese himself would later not replicate or emulate directly, but like Goodfellas is clearly indebted to The Godfather,
Mhm.
despite being held on a similar stature, and understandably so.
I guess I sort of didn't touch on sort of my history with the Godfather film. So I sort of was starting to get into film around 2018, 2019,
Mhm.
and the Godfather films are like one of the first films where it's like, oh, you have to watch that because it's the Godfather.
Right.
So I remember they had all been added to like a streaming service here, and I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna just sort of marathon all of them, which in hindsight, I was a terrible idea. And I didn't end up doing that actually. I gave up. I started watching part one and I'm like, yep, I'll watch this. I got about halfway through and I was like, fuck, it's late. I'm like, it's late at night. So I just paused it and I went to bed and I finished it the next morning. And then I didn't watch parts two and three until like the last couple days. So it's really
Mhm.
quite fresh in my memory, those ones. But to sort of get onto the first, I think the first film, I mean, I know this is going to be hideously controversial, but I think the first one is the weakest of the three. Uh, and I mean, I don't and say the hideously controversial. I don't. I don't love any of these films. I also don't think they're completely terrible. I don't think any of them are like completely terrible films. They're all way too long. I'm I honestly don't think there's too much in them. If you get like it's like if you're gonna make a film that's 3 hours or more, like use it properly. Like I know this is sort of people like this isn't valid criticism or whatever. Or some people are like, oh, that's not a real complaint or anything. I think it is valid
Mhm.
to pacing is the thing more than anything. If you're gonna do make a 3 hour film, I think pacing matters. And I think that's sort of the point. So like you make a 3 hour film, fine, but you need to pace. It needs to be paced properly, and
Mhm.
is like everything you're putting in this necessary. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is. So it's sort of a general sort of like the idea. And there are films that I've watched that are like 90 minutes, and I'm like, God, this is still going on. And there's films that I've seen that are like nearly 3 hours. And I'm like, that was great. Like Barry Lyndon. I remember
Mhm.
when I watched Barry Lyndon, I'm like, oh, this is really quite good. I'm like, oh, and I just sort of was like, how far in this movie? I'm like, oh, I'm this, Barry Lyndon is paced very well,
Mhm.
and that's a 3 hour film, so it's just sort of how it's paced that's more than anything. It's not the inherent. I'm not inherent. I mean, if I do see that a film is 3 hours, I'm like, okay, this is gonna be a lot. But I'm like, but I'll go in and I'll go in with an open mind. I saw yeah, what I mean? Films are getting longer now, but it's like, films are just getting exponentially longer and longer. But
Mhm.
it's just sort of how you use that time. That's like th- more the issue than anything. It's how the time is utilized, not inherently the time. But the film doesn't it. Inherently, I don't necessarily have a problem. It's just like how do you utilize that time and how do you
Mhm.
pace the film?
I mean, I definitely agree with the sentiment that if you're going to make a really long film, it should earn its length. It should be paced appropriately. However, I part one, I'm still of like the, I guess, generic stance that it's very much earned its reputation. And like it's valid. Like I agree wholeheartedly with like its stature, and I think it's a superbly constructed film. Part one, part two,
Mhm,
both of them together, superbly, immaculately constructed, perfect
mhm,
in basically every way. And on the topic of pace, when I rewatched them, I was like honestly like awestruck by
mhm,
two things, I would say. Well, not two things, more than two things. But two of my biggest observations, because I hadn't seen either of these movies in quite a few years. But I was struck by like, despite my, I feel like my 14-year-old, 13-year-old memory of The Godfather Part One almost like built it up as this way more complex thing than it is. And I don't mean that
mm,
negatively, but like when I rewatched it, I was taken aback by like how simple the story is and like how easy
yeah,
it is to follow. Because I feel
mhm,
like 13 and 14-year-old me, when I very uninitiated into film beyond like Inception, I was like,
mhm,
whoa, there's so many characters, there's so many layers. This is hard to keep track of. But now I'm like,
mhm,
wow, that was really straight. Like I could see like I could see the plot as it was unfolding.
mhm,
Like, yep, it's going here, it's going here. This is happening. This is happening. It's all falling into place perfectly. Um, and that could sound like a criticism that I think it's like overly simple, but
mhm,
honestly, I found like so much richness in that it wasn't afraid to like have a fairly straightforward, a lot of characters for sure, but have a fairly
yeah,
straightforward conflict and structure. Um, where like you're following the Corleone family and just their journey through this this mob boss war that they've started.
yeah,
But you can like follow that pretty simply, but then like all the characters sprouting off of that central thread are like very, there's a lot of richness and humanity in the characters, I feel like, which then part
mhm,
two it compounds on. And like every scene
mhm,
feels like it's developing a new facet of every single character. They all feel like different people, but real people who have like diverging views and perspectives, but they're working together. I guess that all sounds very like screenwriting 101, but
mhm,
I was just impressed with like how much humanity it maintains within its like crazy crime, violence antics, um,
mhm,
and also just like how pointed, the commentary on like the American dream and how it's kind of a lie, and
mhm,
like if the striving for power and money is just ultimately going to corrupt you in the end. Like it feels, when I was rewatching, I was struck less by the superficial complexity of the plot and more
mhm,
by like how vile these characters become and how corrupted by their
mhm,
own greed they become, and like how really that's
mhm,
the point. And I think
yeah,
that's kind of obvious from an adult perspective, but when my memory was all stemming from like my 14-year-old self, just like being impressed by the multi-layered structure and all these characters killing each
mhm,
other, it's like I've grown a deeper appreciation for the storytelling, and that the structure's not, in either film isn't this complex difficult thing, but like the richness of the characters and themes feels very unique. I'm not sure if there's really another mafia focused film that like reaches this level of like richness in the characters, and you like really feel the emotion of their rise and fall in part one and part two. um, Obviously, something like Goodfellas or The Irishman comes very close, very reasonably close to like recapturing that human aspect of like the American crime film. But
Mhm.
The Godfather, I feel like sits ever so slightly above the rest of the heap that it inspired, where like I think the ending of part two especially really strikes me because there's the in the final moments of part two where it bounces back to before part one, like before it
Mhm.
started. And Michael's fresh out of college. He wants to join the military. He wants to get away from this legacy
Mhm.
his family has built. He's like this young, hopeful, idealistic kid, and his family resents him for it. Like, your father had all these plans for you. You're going to inherit our dynasty. Like, you can't just forsake all of that. Almost like gaslighting him into feeling bad about not wanting to be a criminal. And then it immediately jumps back to the very end of the part two narrative where he's just the famous shot of him sitting out in the yard just staring
Mhm.
out at the
Yeah.
lake, just near tears of like everything he's what he's done to his family, to like his soul, his humanity, everything that like actually means something in life, all in the name of like building up and maintaining this power. And I that juxtaposition right at the end, it like sealed the deal for me. Like, just appreciating the part one and part two package is like this
Mhm.
essentially perfectly constructed like rise and fall of this American capitalist, like the folly of capitalism. All that said, I wouldn't. While The Godfather certainly treated part one and two are treated as like top 10 of all time level, um,
Mhm.
in like the general
Oh, yeah.
discourse.
That's
I wouldn't put either that high, just in like my personal rankings. um, there's films that I
yeah. Oh,
connect to more
yeah.
emotionally.
There's something sort of emotionally cold about them, I felt,
Hmm.
in that I couldn't I'm not saying that, like, I there was just something about it where I just couldn't but the first one more the second one had more to it, and there
Hmm.
were ideas in the third like, there are elements of the third one which, like, look, we'll get into the third one later. Concepts and ideas third one that I really like, that I really
Hmm.
connect with, that aren't fully explored.
Right.
And I think the second film has sort of a bit more has sort of elements to it, but this isn't always necessarily a hard and fast rule, but there was sort of a bit missing, I guess. There were sort of
Hmm.
I just sort of was watching them and just couldn't connect with it. And it's not like I
Hmm.
need, I like I like Goodfellas, for example, and I don't necessarily connect to the characters in Goodfellas,
Hmm.
but I didn't find these films as interesting as they could have been. And that's like a personal thing.
Hmm.
I completely understand that. There was just sort of a
Hmm.
case of like I wasn't massively I to be honest, I didn't love any of the acting. I mean, we're gonna have to get into the acting, and I've made my feelings clear, not on record, but off record, that I don't like Marlon Brando as as an actor, and he's the most iconic part of the film, I would say. I think he's
Definitely.
and I don't it's not that his performance is like completely terrible or anything. I don't think he's like completely awful in this film. I just don't think there's anything about his performance in The Godfather where I'm like, this is an all-time great performance. Like, this is an
Hmm.
Oscar-winning performance, and
Hmm.
I don't get it. I don't. I mean, first, beyond the fact that I would very much argue he's not the lead character in it, I would argue Michael is the lead actor in that film. I think Brando is supporting in that film, but
Hmm.
whatever, that's a whole other thing. I think but I very much think Marlon Brando's performance, it's not really doing anything that's like, I don't know what he's bringing to the performance that it's like another actor couldn't bring. And I've never seen Marlon Brando and been like, "Oh, that's a great actor." And again, I know that what I'm saying is hideously controversial. You know, people love
Mhm.
Marlon Brando. He's one of the most beloved, like well-respected actors. And there's just something about him. And I tried to put his personal life aside, which I mean, I'm not a fan of him as a person. He didn't seem like he
Mhm.
was a particularly nice person. But there's just nothing where I can, but it's the same thing with like Dustin Hoffman, right? Dustin Hoffman
Mhm.
seems like, from everything I've heard, he wasn't a very good guy, but he is
Right.
a very good actor. So it's like I can sort of be like, okay, I don't think he's a good person, but I still think he gives great performances. But there's
Mhm.
just something about Marlon Brando where that just his sort of just mumbling everything, and there's there's the infamous, there's like the speech he gives in Apocalypse Now, and they're like it's 20 minutes long or whatever, and they cut it down to like five, whatever. I'm like, well, like if he's just like if you ramble on for 20 minutes, it probably wasn't like, and you can cut it down to like a quarter of that. It's I don't I like it's clearly not worth much as a speech if it's like if you can condense 20 minutes down to like I don't know if it's five or whatever, but it's like a considerably smaller amount. So I just sort of think it's baffling that he's sort of seen as this all time great actor. And I get,
Mhm.
and I've seen, and I've seen On the Waterfront, which is also a very well regarded film, and I thought that film was not particularly great, and I thought he was really quite bad in that film as well, to be honest. And
Mhm.
I also think, to just sort of point it out, because he won Best Lead Actor, and he won it over Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier in Sleuth, which Sleuth is a phenomenal film, like a fantastic piece of work.
Mhm.
And Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier are considerably better, and they are more deserving. I mean, I would, I mean, it, you could debate whether both of them are lead because just those two characters in Sleuth. But yeah, I think it's just interesting that Marlon Brando is put up the lead actor
Mhm.
of that film and is sort of seen as this all-time great, and this iconic like it's
Mhm.
an iconic performance, regardless of my feelings on it.
Yeah.
It is iconic, and I just don't think he's doing anything that another actor couldn't have done
Mhm.
better.
I think I can give you some leeway with that. Like, I don't agree with everything you said. Um, I
I wasn't
I
expecting you
have I
to. I
have
know yeah.
I have to admit that I think Brando in general is a very excellent
Mm,
actor. Out of what I've seen, which is mainly like his most prized work. So I'm
yes.
coming from like
Yeah.
a slanted perspective. I do think I don't necessarily view his performance in The Godfather as I think it's excellent. I think I'm not going to badmouth the best actor win, at least not without seeing Sleuth first. um, I think it's an excellent performance. Not that I
Okay.
view this I don't think there's like this. I don't think I have this mysticism around it that it's like I under I understand the all-time opinions on it, and I don't
Mhm.
disagree. But also,
Okay.
it's like I don't know how to describe it. Like where it's like one of those performances where it's like, yes, everything being done here is superb and perfectly done.
Mhm.
He's certainly transforming into this character, but also I'm not like, yes, this is inherently the peak of acting. Nobody can touch this. This is the best of all time. Like, I don't know. I guess
Yeah.
I'm
Like,
like, I see the perspective. I somewhat agree, but I'm not like mystified by Brando's incredible talents and how did he do this. Um,
yeah.
I guess I can back up your claims a little bit by saying I feel like Pacino really encapsulates like the soul of The Godfather, at least in part one and part
Mhm.
two. Like it's his
Yeah.
arc that means everything. Um, and
Yeah.
I would say he's the best part of both films. Good to great work now and then.
I mean, I guess we might as well talk about, yeah, Pacino now, yeah, on him.
It's obvious that Michael is like the character to follow in terms of like getting the point of The Godfather. Um,
Mhm,
I do agree that he's like the pretty much the lead of the first movie as well. Um,
mhm,
I guess I don't really care about the placement of him supporting Brando lead. I get why it was done. Obviously, Pacino is the clear lead of the second movie. Like no arguing that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
everybody agrees. um,
yeah,
but I think Pacino is the best part of both films. Perhaps he's less flashy and chameleon-like than Brando in the first one. I think the
mhm, right,
emotion of Michael's character is what really lands the first two films for me, anyway. And I think Pacino
mhm,
conveys that arc of like this naive, well-meaning young kid slash young adult um, into like this cold hardened, selfish,
mhm,
um, misogynistic, every bad word you could think of, like this awful crime
yeah,
boss who destroys his family and betrays
mhm,
his literal, like he kills his own family. Spoiler alert, I guess. Yet I feel like Pacino like puts so much distance between his early Michael and his later Michael. Like
mhm,
you don't even you it feels like years went by. Obviously that's indicative of the story being told, but when you put that up against the fact that the movies are filmed 2 years apart, it's very impressive to me that
mhm,
Pacino had that like that foresight to stretch out the performance like that, give the illusion of time passing and like of this
mhm,
grand arc forming in what really was just such a small amount of time. Perform both Pacino performances in both films. Would say maybe controversially have a stronger case for being in the all-time discussion than Brando.
I mean, in general, I really like Al Pacino because it's you can't not,
Hmm.
you
No,
know,
you have to love Al Pacino.
Dog Day Afternoon is yeah, I would say Dog Day Afternoon is his best work.
Hmm.
I think that's a fantastic film, and I think he really does a lot of
Hmm. Yes.
in that film. And I think in the
Yes.
first Godfather, there's not as much that he's given to do. I think he does improve in the
Hmm.
second one. The second one really does give him a lot more to work with, and there's elements
For
of
sure.
part three that, like part three, it's not as conveyed as well as it could be,
Hmm.
but there are ideas that they're playing with in part three where I'm like, okay, this is like
Hmm.
really great, where we're really we're getting close to just sort of going over that edge and being able to we're right on the precipice, just need a little just one more just little push and then boom, we're there. Um
Hmm.
that they're dealing with in part three that I think is yeah, some of the most interesting stuff in any of these films. But part three doesn't
Hmm.
fully come together as is
No.
very I mean, everybody knows this. Everybody,
Yes.
thinks this. But we'll get onto that later. I mean, to sort of talk about all three films, all three were nominated for Best Picture, which is quite
Hmm.
impressive. It's very rare for multiple films in a franchise to get a Best Picture nomination. Like the only other ones I
Yes.
can think of are the Lord of the Rings films,
Hmm. Yeah, I think
and
that's
I
it.
can't think of any other. It's just Lord of the Rings. It's just
Yeah.
the one of the most iconic,
Hmm.
well-respected franchises of all time, and Lord of the Rings, which were one of the biggest like a cultural, Lord of the Rings was sort of
Hmm.
this massive thing as well, and
Yes.
um, I mean, just sort of looking at these films and that sort of the films that were either for Best Picture, the first two Godfather films won Best Picture, Part Three did
Hmm.
not win because people didn't like that one as
Thankfully.
much. It had lost to Dances with Wolves. But looking at that year, the year Godfather Part 3 was nominated, I've seen three of those films, and it's a really solid lineup of what I have seen. I haven't seen Dances with Wolves or Awakenings yet, but Ghost, Godfather Part 3, and Goodfellas, all, you know, they're all of varying quality, but they're all
Mhm.
I like all of those films. I think
Mhm.
I mean, Goodfellas is very much my favorite of those.
Mhm.
But I,
Understandably.
Dances with under yeah, Dances with Wolves is a uh, that's sort of that year of it's sort of that thing of like, oh, Goodfellas is like the more iconic, beloved film that has
Mhm.
permeated pop culture more than
Right.
Dances with Wolves. But I know people who are like who've seen Dances with Wolves and are like, yeah, no, I still thought it was pretty solid, and it's not an
Mhm.
undeserving Best Picture winner, even if I prefer, you know, Goodfellas or whatever. They're like, it's a
Yeah.
solid film. It's not an undeserved film. So I
Mhm.
think that's a really decent. And I haven't seen Awakenings either. I don't really know what
Me
Awakenings is, to be honest, but
Me neither.
yeah, it's like that's a surprisingly that's never seen as like a strong Best Picture lineup. If you look at if you sort of
Mhm.
talking to people about strong Best Picture lineups, that one's
Mhm.
sort of never in the conversation. But and then yeah, there's sort of Godfather Part One, Part Two, both nominated and both won. But I mean, personally, I would have given it to Chinatown over the Godfather Part
Mhm.
Two of the ones I've seen. I mean, I don't love Chinatown either, to be honest. I do like Chinatown, but I'm just like again, it's that thing of like it's good. It's just like it's not quite there. There's like just something missing. I'm
Right.
like we don't quite have, and I haven't seen any of the other films nominated either side of The Godfather's the first one, so I can't comment on that. And but these are massive Oscar favorites. I mean, the first Godfather
Mhm.
was, I believe, the highest grossing film of 1972, which is just
Mhm.
crazy to me that
Right.
because it's this film wouldn't be the highest grossing because of the way cinema has changed and evolved in the last 50 years. The Godfather, a film like The Godfather, there's just no realm where that kind of film can be the highest grossing film of the year anymore,
Definitely not.
just because of how film is changed. And that's not a slight against the industry now. It's just looking at it, it's like this doesn't
Yes.
to look at what was the highest gross because you look at the
Mhm.
highest grossing films of the last 15, 20 years or so, and it's like it's pretty much all massive, it's all blockbuster stuff, which obviously makes sense, but it's all like
Mhm.
it's sequels or it's some form of IP. Like
Mhm.
you just look at the list of highest grossing film. I'm getting the highest list of grossing films just of all time, just to look at like the past however many years, and it's like it's all mass, and then again, I like those films. I'm not someone who dislikes modern blockbusters, but just looking at film, like The Godfather, highest grossing film of that year. Following year, The Exorcist was the highest grossing film.
Mhm.
Towering Inferno, Jaws, Rocky, Star Wars. Like a lot of these are kinds of films where it's
Right.
like they wouldn't be. I mean, Rain Man was the highest grossing film of 1988. Like that would not be happening nowadays,
No.
And Rain Man's a great film, but it would not happen. It
Yes.
is, and I mean, the industry it has is ever changing, ever evolving, and you do see films now where it's like this isn't gonna. I mean, like Martin Scorsese, as he's sort of the sort of he's a very well known, respected filmmaker, and his films aren't even going to cinemas. Like they go into cinemas to be eligible for the Oscars, and then they're on streaming like 3 weeks
Mhm.
later. It's just this interesting the evolution of the
Yeah.
film experience. Like you can't, and I think I think it was kind of inevitable, like that this is obviously going to happen, and what is successful now what was successful 50 years ago isn't going to be successful in the way film, you know.
Right.
And maybe it does well, maybe it makes back money, but it's never going to be one of the highest grossing films
Right.
of the year just because of the and I think part of it also is streaming. I think streaming
For
is a
sure.
massive part that's killing the cinema experience, and streaming I've talked about this a lot. I think probably on pod, but definitely off pod. Of just cinema of streaming is terrible. Like it's just
Mhm.
the way it's implemented and used. Like I think the general concept, the idea of streaming is good, but it is also it's killing the cinema market. It's killing physical media. It's a
Mhm.
massive and then you get so many places like Netflix and Disney Plus. It's like they could have all this content here, but they're taking it away because they don't want to have to pay
Yeah.
royalty. So it's like, well, why
Nothing's
am I
permanent. Yeah.
paying? Why am I paying for this? And if you're not going to
Mhm.
release physical versions of your shows or your films, there's gonna be media
Mhm.
that's just gonna be lost.
I feel like you can boil down like the entire modern industry down to like content for the sake of it. Um, just like mass
Mm,
production of everything ever to just like
mhm,
momentarily capture people's attention on the streaming
mhm,
algorithms. It's
mhm,
it is dystopian, and
mhm,
bleak. Though
mm,
at the very least, I think you can spin it positively to where like the industry has always been in flux, has always gone up and down in terms of
mhm,
prioritizing creativity, artistry, original ideas. It's not been a straight line, it hasn't been a straight decline. And I think there's like we've seen now, like last year was the first time writers and actors were on strike against the big the big wigs of Hollywood. At the same time, since the 1960s, we see a lot of like big budget blockbusters, legacy sequels, regular sequels underperforming, if
mhm,
they're not very good. Um, like, not that they flop horrifically, but they don't do what they're expected to do. And
mm,
then there's like almost every year now, there's like a handful of like indie slash mid budget success stories of like these wholly original movies, like way outperforming like their own stature, not being like cultural phenomenons, but doing well
mhm,
for what they are. I mean, obviously, Oppenheimer is like this golden child now of like wholly original, prestigious think piece doing nearly 1 billion at the box office. Um, and as much as Oppenheimer wasn't like my top film of last year or like my personal favorite to win Best Picture, I fully appreciate what it's done, for
mhm.
the industry. Um, and then obviously on a much smaller scale, like Everything Everywhere All at Once being this
Yeah.
big indie hit. And there's still a bunch of examples like that that like give you hope, and like there's proof that if you make something original that's really good, people will respond to it, people gravitate towards that. And it's like
Mhm,
maybe, just maybe, slowly we're shifting away from like this big studio, revolving door of sequels and whatever, kind of slowly towards like a new Hollywood part two, where like
mhm,
eventually, eventually we'll redo this 1970s. There is a way to like spin the whole dystopian, everything's falling apart, streaming is taking over everything, but nobody even likes streaming anymore. It's turning into cable TV. um, there's like as much as that feels like the unavoidable death of everything, of all creativity. It's like,
mhm,
but maybe people will respond in the opposite direction, and there are signs of that, of like actual auteur driven projects, unique projects doing well, getting funding, like creative risks that are paying off. Like there's ever so slowly seeming to be a shift away. Like people are rejecting and like turning away from streaming a little bit to back towards like the theater is this pop culture event that actually
Mhm.
puts out interesting things. um,
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see how it all develops over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think everything will swing back at some point. I think
Hmm.
it's I mean, people, this always happens every now and again. I think sort of the 80s and sort of 90s were seen as sort of creative ruts. Like
Yeah.
every now and again, there's like
Hmm.
periods where people are like, oh, this is like the worst decade. This is the worst period of films, and I think some
Right.
people would say we're in that period now. And I mean, I don't know if I'd fully agree with that. I understand to a degree there are like,
Hmm.
look, there's lots of shit being made. Like, there's some really bad stuff being made. Like, I'm not gonna pretend that's not happening. But that's true of any period. Not every film that was
Yeah.
made in the 70s was a great
Good.
piece of cinema or anything.
Right.
Exactly. Like it's like and you see like Quentin Tarantino on podcasts being like, oh yeah, we're in the worst place time for film. He's just talking about
Hmm.
how we're in this terrible place for films, and it's like, yeah, but it's like if you just look, and you see people being like, oh, films, oh shit. It's like, are you just watching the studio
Yeah.
stuff? Because it's like you look
Exactly.
at stuff from A24 and Neon, like it's not, and hell,
Hmm.
even Searchlight, which is under Disney's umbrella, but still, they're still good films being made. So like you do
Right.
need to sort of look
Ref-
beyond the big Hollywood stuff, And I mean, I like
Right.
the big Hollywood studio stuff, but I'm not just watching that. I go beyond that, I'm like, oh, this,
Hmm.
but I think there will be a pendulum swing. We are on
Yes.
a lesser end. We're on the side where it's like, okay, it's gonna swing back at some point. This is just sort of the evolution again of
Hmm.
cinema. It's just like it's on one side, the pendulum's gone this way, and it'll swing back the other way at some
Hmm.
point in the future. It's not going to be like an immediate thing because
Right.
films take ages to be made,
Mhm.
but we're on one side, and it'll go back the other way. I think that yeah, I just the biggest issue I had, and this sort of goes through all three of the films. To be honest, it's not just limited to one of them. It's sort of a general. Is I just found myself not that engaged. Like I don't
Mhm.
know if I want to say I just didn't love what was happening. I'm like, okay, this is cool, and this is like fine. The
Right.
stuff probably my favorite stuff in any of these films is the De Niro stuff in part two. I thought the De Niro stuff
Mhm.
in part two was really, really great. And if the whole second film was just the De Niro stuff, I'd probably
Mhm.
love it. I'd think that was like a fantastic because the De Niro stuff for me was just like the best scene in any of these films is the scene in part two where De Niro he's like going across the rooftops, he's like following this guy who's just sort of causing issues, and he just follows this guy and then
Mhm.
like kills like that. I thought like that's a great scene. Like there's just
Mhm.
the way that's put together and the way it's constructed. I'm like, that's a great scene. I think that I mean I prefer Robert De Niro as an actor to Marlon Brando, so that helps him
Mhm.
too. Helps as well that it's like you're replacing an actor I don't like with an actor that I think is an all timer. I think De Niro
Mhm.
like again, he's up there with Pacino in the sense of like you just have to like him. Like he's just
Exactly.
he never took well late the latter career we don't talk about as much, but even then he still turned in some good performances in his
Yeah,
latter
he's
career.
still better than
Um,
Pacino. Yeah.
yeah, I mean in the Killers of the Flower Moon, I thought he was excellent in that. That was and it, like the whole film. If these films were operating at that level of it's a
Mhm.
simple scene. It's just De Niro following this guy, but just the way it's put together, the way it's constructed, it's like this is really good. And if like the
Mhm.
whole film was like that, I'd get it. But it's not, so I just couldn't, So I think, but so that there were glimpses of it where I was like, okay, I see this, like I get it. I'm like, this is really great. It just never felt like it crossed the level of like
Mhm.
okay, the whole film is operating at this level. I get this with a lot of films where there's like scenes where I'm like, this is operating at a level where it's like, if the whole film was at this level, I'd love it.
Mhm.
But it's like only in
Mhm.
intermediate points where it's like, okay, this it's so
Right.
close to be, and that's just sort of. Again, I know this is all a personal thing for me. I know
Mhm.
like people, they love these films, the first two anyway, but I just sort of wasn't. Yeah, I didn't love everything I was doing, and I think I mean, yeah, I'm fully on the side that part two is better than part one. Um, it's considerably better. I think Al Pacino is doing a lot more in that film. I don't
Definitely.
remember like him having much to do. Like I would say he's the main character in the first film, but there's elements of part two where I'm like, okay, this is he's doing a bit more to work with. There's some really good stuff here that he's getting
Mhm.
some good material to work with. And I think I think part two is very. It's also got it is structurally a bit messy. I think the way I love the idea of a film having sort of two stories playing sort of
Right.
simultaneously, but it didn't feel like they were intercut properly. It was just sort of like, oh, we're
Mhm.
gonna cut to Pacino for 40 minutes. Now we're gonna cut to De Niro for 5 minutes. It didn't feel like there was any thematic reason as to why, like,
Mhm.
okay, we're gonna have this scene happen, like Pacino's doing this thing, and we're gonna go back and see a De Niro doing something that sort of thematic,
Mhm.
like it didn't feel thematically justified in the sense of it just sort of felt arbitrary when the film was cutting between
Mhm.
the different perspectives. It didn't feel to me like, okay, now this happens, so this relates to this, and so we're going to cut to this. It was just sort of every now and again, we're just going to cut from here to here. So it
Mhm.
felt messy in that, but and I was far more engaged whenever it cut to dinner. I was like, oh, this is the good stuff. This is the stuff I'm really like enjoying.
Mhm.
But it just sort of felt like I kind of feel like maybe it should have just sort of focused on one, either just
Mhm.
done the Pacino stuff or done the De Niro stuff, because as is, it feels a bit messy. I mean, I still liked it. I do like the film. It's just it is messier. I would
Mhm.
say it's messier than the first film, but there's more interesting elements in part two that make me
Mhm.
like it more.
Yeah. I certainly I don't hold it against anyone for, like, watching the Godfather films and, like, appreciating them enough, but not being, like, insanely invested in the story. Like, I can see that. And I also agree both that part 2 is more interesting and has more interesting stuff going on, but, like, purely on a comparison level, it is, like, ever so slightly messier than the first just because of the
Mhm,
intercutting. But also, like, personally, I found the intercutting done well, and I will
mhm,
say the De Niro stuff, I agree, the De Niro stuff is great. I struggle to favor the De Niro versus the Pacino stuff. Like, I don't know which I'd pick personally, although maybe I can get behind you in that De Niro's veto is more interesting than Brando's veto.
I will say they do kind of give De Niro more to work with. I think Brand
They
because
do.
it's about him coming up, whereas Brando's kind of
Exactly.
like he's already in the head, so he
Exactly.
can't really go anywhere, whereas De Niro has the arc.
Right. Yeah, I feel that's exactly what I was thinking, where it's like I fully respect both performances for what they did for the character, and I think they both brought exactly what was needed for the character in their specific times of Vito's life. Brando's Vito is much more stationary um, in terms of development, and that's just how
Mhm,
it is, and that makes sense why it's that way. But I do certainly get more intrigue out of De Niro's Vito, if only just on like a writing level, because he's developing into this crime boss of sorts.
mhm.
Much which juxtaposed with Pacino, I think it overall the structure works well of like them both like rising to this level and like
Mhm.
corrupting everything they hold dear, blah blah blah. I guess I don't feel super strongly either way about like the cutting being super strategic or like thematically apt. I see what you're saying about that because like even now, having just watched them, I can't like recall like specific moments where it would switch between the timelines and like it would feel incredibly poignant.
We
Yeah.
haven't really talked about the third one. We've really focused
Mhm.
on parts 1 and 2. So part 3, one of the most infamously maligned films in terms of in the sense of the
Yes.
legacy it comes from. Like
Right.
Godfather's Part 1 and Part 2 held up as considered two of the greatest films of all time, like in the top 10 on IMDb and Letterboxd and
Mhm.
AFI. I'm sure they're very high on like Sight and Sound's list because obviously they are, because that just makes sense for Sight and Sound. Yeah. And then Godfather Part 3 is sort of that weird third chapter. It was made considerably later than the other two. Like
Mhm.
parts 1 and 2 were made 2 years apart, 1972 and 1974, and then they just sort of didn't touch it because I've
Mhm.
never read the book. I've never read the Godfather book, so I don't know how
Me
much
neither.
of that encapsulates it. If the book is like they sort of split part 1 and part 2, like they're both adapting from the book. I don't know like what the if that's why or anything. I don't know. Like I've never read the book, but I know someone who he
Mhm.
doesn't like the Godfather films that much, but he quite liked the book, so I might read the book at some point. But yeah, they made Godfather Part 3, 1990, famously despised.
Yes.
So I went in with that knowledge, but I was like, I'm gonna go in with like an open mind and be like, I don't because I don't love the first two, so I'm like, maybe that's why people don't like it as much is because they love the
Mhm.
first two. That this seems like an affront to them. It's like you're just, you're shitting on these two great films. So but I was like, I'm gonna go in because I don't care. And I mean, I didn't. I don't hate it. I think it's perfectly watchable. I will say though, the worst bit of any of these films is Sofia Coppola's performance. I can't. I'm not going to try and defend it because it is terrible, but I don't want to place blame on her because
Right.
I don't think it's her fault. That I don't think it's fair to blame her because it's like, from my understanding, Francis just sort of put her in that role,
Right.
even though there's no need for her to be there because she's not an actor. And
Exactly.
she's we've seen that she is, a filmmaker. Yeah, a very well respected filmmaker. And yeah, her performance, it was really as bad as everyone says it is. Like, and I'm like, man, she's
Yes.
really is that bad. Because I was like, can she really be that bad? And like her first couple lines, I'm like, oh, she can't sell that at all. This is
No.
yeah, and
Yeah, so
yeah, everybody knows that she's
yeah.
bad. So yeah,
Yeah, Sophia is definitely not good in it, but like you said, it's like I don't want to dwell on it because like people try to use her as
everybody
like everyone uses her as like a scapegoat for why the film is not up to par. Um,
Mhm.
but clearly, Coppola made the choice to cast his daughter with no acting experience in this
Yeah.
titular role, and like that's on
Yeah.
him.
Yeah, no, it's
So
completely on him, yeah.
it's it's not a good performance by any means, not at all. And
You.
she does not sell it. Um, she
Mm.
also, maybe I'm insane, but I swear, anytime she was on screen, it was like she doesn't look like she's there. She looks like she's like edited into the frame.
Well, I feel like I read something that her performance had to be dubbed in, and
That
maybe
could
I'm
be
just
it.
because
That might
I
be
don't I'm gonna look this up because this I want
that
to know if this is because I feel like I've heard this.
that could have been creating the feel the sense that she wasn't there because but I
Yeah.
swear like when I was looking at her on the screen I'm like she looks like she was edited into the frame.
Yeah,
most of the
it's like
time.
she was shot on a green screen and they were just like,
Yeah, like that's why she
I
can't act well because no one is around. She actually was on a
yeah,
sound stage.
it's like when you watch the Star Wars prequels and the performances are all terrible from generally really good actors, but it's like they don't have anything to work with. Yeah, so apparently Sofia Coppola, so she was born in Southern California, and yeah, she could not mask her Valley Girl accent, which that definitely doesn't help because these aren't people like Italia, they're not
Right.
from yeah
The
Southern
Valley.
California, they're not from the Valley, and it's like and and obviously she couldn't mask because she's not an actor. Again, that we
Right,
that's the point.
exactly.
Like she's not an actor, so I don't blame her for not being able to hide her accent because when you're an actor, you
Right,
learn how to you see but if you're
exactly.
not an actor, it's hard to mask it. Yeah,
Yes,
I mean, yeah, people think. I honestly think she's probably the biggest reason as to why this film is seen as poorly as it is.
it is.
And I
She
mean, I
is.
didn't hate it. Don't get me wrong, she's the worst part of any of these films. Like, even I don't even love the first film that much. But, and to be fair, I don't think Brando's giving a great performance there. But it's like, she is giving a really noticeably bad performance. Like, it's like, my
Yeah.
God. It's noticeably quite bad, but it's talked to death. But on the whole, I didn't hate Godfather Part 3. I thought it was perfectly fine. I didn't think it was like a massive train wreck of a film.
Mhm,
I thought it was the most interesting in terms of the ideas it's dealing with, not in terms of how it's
mhm,
presented or how it's played. I really like the idea of a film about um I like films about people getting old or characters
mhm.
getting old and how you
Yeah,
focus on that. I think that's
right.
something super interesting to focus on that. And I get this a lot with sort of other films like superhero stuff where you see an older version of a character, who's like or you see this, like Logan, for example, is
Mhm,
sort of a prime recent example I think works really well is seeing
mhm.
yeah, Wolverine as an old man. I think that's a very good film, and I think
Exactly.
just focusing, Blade Runner does it with Harrison Ford. I mean, the recent Star Wars
Mhm,
films did it with Luke and Han and Leia and all that, and I think there's something
mhm,
really interesting about that, about focusing on these characters. And I think that makes Part 3 the most interesting to me from a conceptual level. It just again, it doesn't
mhm.
feel like it quite gets over the line. It's like it's
Yeah.
right on the edge, and then it's okay, you just need to go just like just a little bit further and it will get there. And if the
Yes.
ideas it was dealing with were portrayed better, I'd be like, okay, this is great. But
Mhm.
they're just not. Um, but on the whole, I did enjoy
Mhm.
watching it. I don't have a desire to
Mhm.
watch any of these films again, but I didn't hate the experience.
I think I think we really agree on this one, and I think
Mm,
I can see why someone who would have seen the original first 2 films, like, way back in the day before part 3 came out, would be, like, absolutely appalled at what they're witnessing.
yeah,
Like, I can see why you'd have these, like, insurmountable expectations, and then you just get
yeah,
this vaguely passable follow-up
yeah.
and be, like, completely distraught. But, I mean, I think I went into it knowing with my expectations obviously tempered, um,
Hmm.
and, like, kind of hoping to just, like, get out of it what I could,
Hmm.
appreciate what I could, um, and I guess that's kind of the modern interpretation of it is
Hmm.
it's not great. It's maybe not good even, but it's like this thing you can kind of appreciate where it's going. Obviously, it has glaring
Yeah,
flaws in the
yeah.
performances, casting, but it's like not
Oof.
irredeemable. And I do feel
Hmm.
that. I think you're right that it poses a lot of really interesting ideas. Perhaps The Irishman is everything The Godfather Part 3 wished as it was, in
Yeah.
terms of like this aged criminal
Mm,
mastermind, reflecting on his life and
mhm.
kind of seeking redemption and like wanting to rebuild his relationship with his family, but then
Yeah.
ultimately everything that he did in his past comes back to haunt him, and like his
Yeah.
efforts are in vain. I think that's a powerful thing to explore. Obviously
Yeah.
the film doesn't do it greatly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird tonal things going on where
Oh, I mean,
it's like
I feel like yeah, I can't ignore this. There's for some inexplicable reason, there's this weird incest storyline. I remember what I was watching it and I'm like, "No.
yeah.
No, we're not doing this. Don't no, Francis, no.
No,
No.
Francis, don't do
No,
that.
Francis. This is weird. This isn't Game of Thrones. This isn't House of the
Exactly.
Dragon.
This is
This
not
is I'm like,
fantasy
"No,
world.
we're not doing this,
Mhm.
Francis." And it's even weirder that I'm like, "Dude, you cast your daughter in this role. Like,
Yeah,
that's
it's
really weird." And I mean, look, we've heard a lot of stories about Francis Ford Coppola, coming out of Megalopolis, and I'm like, "Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm not surprised that
Yeah,
he's
he's a weird dude.
he's yeah, he's got some he's not a great guy. He's defended some really quite despicable people. Like he's
Yes.
really not a good
Yeah, he has
person.
a certainly a weird savior complex of
Yeah.
the reasonably canceled.
Just looking at how he is as a filmmaker, it's like he really I don't understand why he has so many difficulties running a set. Like it's
Mhm.
crazy to me how many of his films there's just horror stories of
Or
like
just a disaster.
Apocalypse yeah, yeah. Apocalypse Now is, like, the infamous one, which is,
Mhm.
like, meant to be shooting for 6 months or something, and then it ballooned to 18 or something. It was
Mhm.
meant to be, like, a pretty short shooting period, and then it just ballooned to a year and a half, and it's like, well, it's what happens when you film in the forest in, Vietnam or
Yes,
wherever it was,
in the jungle.
and,
Yeah.
yeah, heart attack inducing cocaine fueled
Mhm.
just insanity for 18 months. It's like, no, I'm not surprised that
Yeah.
it's a, but I feel like, it's obvious, Megalopolis obviously had its issues that issues have just kept pouring out about this film.
Yeah. Yes,
Just, so it's just, yeah.
the issues
And
are
it's just, yeah, it's
proliferating
crazy.
and the film is not good enough to compensate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, we've heard,
allegedly.
I've seen the reviews. Allegedly. I've
Yes,
not seen it, so I can't comment, but the reviews are
exactly.
not.
Yes.
Yeah, but I just
Then
don't
yeah.
I don't understand why we needed that storyline. I really don't. It's like, why are we
It's
doing
bizarre.
this? It doesn't. First of all, it doesn't add anything.
Mhm.
Like, there's no need for it. When she dies, spoilers. When Sophia Coppola's character dies, it's just like, okay. And that scene is so terribly. I like the stuff when they're in the theater and there's like
Mhm.
the guy sort of running around. Like I think like that's a solid scene.
Mhm.
But then when he comes out and he just starts shooting them, and I'm just like, okay, what do we? And it's just like
Right.
she dies, and it's meant to be this big emotional moment, and I'm like, she cannot sell that.
She
Like it's not her
cannot.
fault, but she cannot sell the emotion of this. And Pacino, like
He's ridiculous.
Pacino is doing. I feel like he must have. Trying his hardest to make this work, but it's like just isn't. This isn't no Pacino. You can't make this work, mate. You can't.
Yeah.
And
I
like that
did
could be a
laugh when he
really powerful.
yeah. I did laugh when he was wailing into the sky. To be honest, I was like, "That's
Yeah.
funny."
I will say there are times where I watch a film and characters they like yell into the sky, and sometimes it's really powerful. It works really well, and then
Yeah.
sometimes it's just like, oh mate, you're trying. This is not working.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then so the version I watched of the film, because I watched it on Paramount Plus, which is a terrible
Mhm.
stream, like streaming. I was watching the film. They're talking in Sicilian in the second film. There's no subtitles for that.
Mhm.
So I tried putting on subtitles, see like if I have to put subtitles on. No, it's got the English bit, and I'm like, I don't need that. I just need to know what
Mhm.
they're saying in Sicilian. and so I had to find a copy online of the film to watch, which I didn't want to do because I'm like, it's right there.
Right.
This is really easy. I just press play, and then when I watch the third one, there's some bits where they're not talking in English, and that gets translated. I'm like, what the f- is this? But the version I
Yeah.
watched, it's not called The Godfather Part 3. It's called The Godfather Coda: The Death of Michael
Yeah.
Corleone. Because I'd listened to a podcast and I knew the ending, the original ending of Part 3, which I don't know if you know what the ending of the original Part 3 is or not.
Mhm.
But it's different. Basically, it's to basic. The Pacino dies at the end of it. He's like sitting in a chair with like some oranges because there's just lots of oranges in these films, and he
Yes.
like throws himself off a chair or something. Like he's like just sitting in a chair and then he just sort of dies. And I'm like, I kind of like the change ending a bit more. It's just a nice sort of. It's a bit more subtle, and I like subtlety
Right.
more than just.
For sure.
Yeah. There's lots of oranges in these films. There's like stuff in the first film where
Yeah.
Brando is squeezing oranges, and then he gets like that's where they tried and assassinate him in the first one, right? He's like squeezing
Mhm.
oranges, and it's
They just
it
like
broad
oranges.
daylight. This happens a lot in gangster films where people just gone down in broad daylight. I'm like, this. I'm not sure if this is
It is
the right. I
shocking.
don't. I mean,
But
yeah,
I guess when you own half the city, it's like you can do
yeah,
anything.
that's true. Also, I just remembered there's a bit we haven't touched on. There's the famous one of the most famous bits of these films is the horse's head scene
Oh
in
yes.
the bed.
Iconic.
Which is iconic. Which is it's just that's one of those scenes where it's like you know it before you watch it. It's like the shower scene in Psycho, where it's like
Yeah.
it's just so ingrained in pop culture. It's like, oh, okay, I know this before it even happened. So it doesn't work really because it's like it's just been parodied so much, and I just
Right.
know it. It's like,
There's not any of that like shock value
yeah.
anymore.
I
Naturally.
mean, yeah, I think these films, yeah, they're just sort of I don't hate any of these films. Like I think like Apocalypse Now I really don't like. I think Apocalypse Now is really quite poor. But I wouldn't say these are poor films. I think there's a lot about these films that I'm on board with. There's some solid
Hmm.
elements to each of them. It's just they don't coalesce
Hmm.
as cohesive. And I know there's like a massive edit of like the first two films, like a TV edit type
Yes.
thing where they sort of which I've never seen and I
Me
might
neither.
consider watching in the future because it's
Mhm.
it's sort of a mul and I think this I just I think in terms of from from a structural point they're all very messy. Well, I think the second one is more messy than the other two,
Mhm.
but it also has more elements going for it that I'm like I like that more. So it's that's why it's my favorite. Like it is structurally messier. It's
Mhm.
too long. I think all three of these films are just a bit too long, and you could definitely trim them down somewhat. And I don't have a desire to watch them again. I think like they're culturally significant and they're worth ticking off. Like I think for all my criticisms of these films, they are worth watching. And I'm sort of a proponent of like watching as many culturally significant films as
Right.
possible, regardless
Mhm.
of whether I like them or not. Like there's films that are culturally significant that I'm like, I don't think I'm going to enjoy that, but it's a massive
Mhm.
part of history of pop culture and
Yeah.
history and film history specifically. So I'm like, I will watch it as a complete.
Mhm.
And you see some people who are like who sort of write certain films off, and it's like, why would you do that? You're
Exactly.
why are
Yeah.
you writing off films that are cultural milestones in some cases, or
Mhm.
like yes, there are films made from the 20s that like yes probably come across as super boring and dull now, but watching them within their context of the 1920s or whatever, it's worth watching them.
I mean, part 3 is worth seeing it, um,
Yeah,
even if it is kind of one giant, like, appendix to a already great story, like, it doesn't need to
yeah,
exist.
exactly.
It's
Yeah,
kinda
exactly.
it's more or less a legacy sequel cash grab rather than like an earnest. I don't want to say nobody tried with it, but it
Yeah.
doesn't pan out. It doesn't pan out the way it
Yeah,
should.
exactly.
But it's
Yeah,
not
exactly.
without merit. Um, I
Mhm.
agree. Some of
Yeah,
like
it's not
the
the train wreck some would have you
no, it's not
believe.
a disaster. Um, I think it handles like the mob violence stuff, like, with the exception of the infamous ending on the steps. I think it
Mm,
handles it well. Like you said, the final act, like in the theater, is really like
mhm.
it's suspenseful. It's well done. It more the movie more falls flat with like the family element, and I don't
Yeah.
know. It's weirdly sappy at times, and
Mm,
I don't know why like um his ex-wife and kids are like so open to like welcoming him back into their lives, because he is like literally he's like literally a murderous monster, but whatever.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's a weird thing, but it's not the worst thing ever. I enjoyed enough of it to say like it's like a 6 out of 10 or whatever. But
yeah. I mean, do
um
you wanna move on to ratings if we've
sure.
done up enough? Yeah, I mean, do you wanna
um
talk? I mean, you've already or you want me to go?
yeah, I mean I can since I started I can go.
You
I
started,
mean
yeah.
I think it goes kind of without saying based on how I've spoken about them that I think the first two are essentially masterpieces, 10 out
Mhm.
of 10, the whole 9 yards. I have to give it that. Like,
Yeah.
I think they're immaculate, and that's just where that's where I stand. The third one, it has its merits, but it is a mess. Um, it's like a 6 out of 10. It's interesting that it was so like it was received with like immediate vitriol, sort of, but also like
Yeah.
got still got like all of its Oscar nominations. Like it's
Oh,
like
it's
people felt
yeah, it's
obligated.
crazy
People were
that
like, we just have to.
it's yeah,
We hate it, but
seen
we
as a
have to
lesser
nominate
film,
it.
but it's still it got nominated for Best Picture. I think
In a
Coppola got
lineup of
nominated for Best
five.
Director.
Yes, Andy Garcia got supporting actor
Oh,
nominated,
that's just
but nobody
crazy.
else got in. Nobody else got in,
Really,
not
not
even
even
Pacino.
huh, huh. That's weird because Pacino is probably the best performance in that film,
He
honestly,
is the
but
best. He is the best part, though also not that great. So I'm not like
I mean, yeah, it's not
losing
an
sleep
amazing
over it.
performance, yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, to quickly
yeah.
go through my ratings, I give the
Mhm.
first film a 6 out of 10. Like, it's just a massive countdown. I give the second one a 7, and honestly,
Mm.
if it was just the De Niro stuff, and it or the film just wasn't as messy, it could be an 8,
Mhm.
possibly pushing a 9. If it was the De
Mhm.
Niro stuff, that could be an 8 or a 9. Or if it was a bit more less messy, it could be that as well. And I give
Mhm.
the third one a very generous, like a very weak 7 as well. I don't hate it. I didn't hate it. Yeah, it was perfectly watchable, but
It
I
is
also don't have
watchable.
a desire to watch it again. It didn't do a whole lot for me, but
Mhm.
I found it perfectly
Yeah.
adequate. Yeah, and we're talking about these films to tie into the release of Megalopolis, which I am genuinely really interested in seeing because it sounds insane, and
Yeah.
I just have to see it. I'm like, I have to see what this film is because I can't.
Yeah.
It's yeah, it's been a long gestating project. It's been in the works for decades, and it
Mhm.
has had so many difficulties. I mean, finding a studio to be like, yeah, we'll put money into a marketing campaign behind this
Right.
film that is almost certainly going to be a massive loss for us because there's no way people are going to turn like this film is going to do so poorly money wise that it's like
Mhm.
I get why it took so long to find a distributor because how do
For
you even
sure.
sell this film? Like there's
Exactly.
no like it's but I am genuinely really interested in it. It's going to be
Mhm.
just
Yes.
it's going to be incredible. I don't know if that's a good Incredible or a bad Incredible. It's just gonna be
And yes, it
it's
won't
gonna
be,
be
or
something.
yeah, it won't be forgettable. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
it'll leave a mark regardless of final quality. It's gonna
Yeah.
be
I
something.
guess, yeah. I'd have to say, I guess I'm just I'm highly intrigued. I have no idea
Yeah,
what I'll
exactly.
think. Um,
Yeah.
it looks
It's got a lot of
one of a
yeah,
kind.
yeah, it definitely is like and I kind of like that though. I like it
Yeah,
when filmmakers are just like, "Fuck it, I'm gonna make a film for me now."
yeah.
Like,
It's
I
just,
do
this is just
respect that
mine.
he's like, yeah, and you know what? I can respect that. I can respect it when someone's like, "I'm doing this for me." I don't get yeah, no,
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm selling. I'm gonna, try and raise as much money to make this film. And Kevin Costner's doing it with his Horizon films, which are also
Doing terribly at the
ridiculously
box office.
yeah, yeah, people aren't seeing. So
Yeah,
I can respect that of just being like, this is for me, and I'm just gonna make what I
yeah,
want.
exactly.
Um,
That's cool.
Even if I don't end up liking it, I can respect
Yeah,
the this is just for me. So
yeah.
so that's pretty much it for this week's episode. Thank you for joining me, Skylar.
Of
Is
course.
there anything you wanted to plug before I wrap this up?
um, I guess people can follow my movie Instagram, Skylar Stuck in the Cinema. I post there semi regularly, and my my letterbox is Skylar in the Cinna. Just that, no MA at the end. But
Is
yeah,
that too
and
many characters? Is that why it's
I don't remember. I don't remember why it's that. Um, that could be why. Don't ask me why. I don't know why.
okay?
But I am absurdly active there. Um,
Hmm.
Probably too active, constantly reviewing
Hmm.
things, but it is what it
Yeah.
is. And you can see my
Yeah.
nonsense over
Doing movie
there.
challenge. You know,
Yes, many challenges at binges at once,
doing
insane
best
stuff.
picture winners
Hmm.
and the
Yes, I
Criterion
watched all.
challenge. All this.
Yes, my new goal is to watch like 15 Coppola movies in the next week and a half because I just forgot that I was going to do that until right
Oh,
now. So that'll be
that's
fun. And they probably
ridiculous.
all suck. They probably all are
Yeah.
bad. So it'll be fun.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
might not finish, but that will
yeah.
be
All
my new
right.
goal for the week.
Yeah.
So watch
Well,
that
yeah.
unfold.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me for this week, Skylar.
Yes, it was much
Uh,
fun.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode. It's a bit of a longer one, which is fine because just means to get more content, and that's
Hmm.
always good because more content.
Yes,
As
more
streaming
content is
services
always
have
good.
taught us, the more content, the
Yes,
better. It doesn't matter
exactly.
the
That's the
quality.
message.
The quality
No,
doesn't matter. It's the
and good thing for
quantity.
that. Yeah.
That's the real important thing. It's just how much
Yes.
content.
Yes.
So
More people
thank you.
talking about the Godfather ad nauseum.
Yes,
Yes. Hmm.
yes,
Yeah.
because there's so many new takes to have on The
We
Godfather.
have many new ideas.
Yeah, so thank you all for listening. I've got a massive back catalog of episodes. It's like 100 something episodes. Like there's just so many, so much. There's hours and
Hmm.
hours of content. So find something to enjoy. I'm sure you will.
Yeah.
And if you don't, well, just wait. Maybe next week we'll have something that you will enjoy instead. So yeah, thank you all for listening to this week's episode, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.